My parents don't like me as much as my brother, so I moved out. My name is Alex, and when I look back at my childhood, it's almost like flipping through pages of two different books. One belonged to my twin brother, Mark, the star of every story, and the other, a quieter, lonelier tale, was mine. Growing up, I always thought that having a twin would mean having a partner in every adventure, someone to share victories and brace against challenges. But the reality, as I learned with time, was nothing like that. Mark and I were born just 5 minutes apart, a detail our parents used to emphasize that Mark was first, as if that fraction of time, somehow, foretold his future of accolades. He was the son they dreamed of, diligent, intelligent, determined. From a young age, he excelled in school and never seemed to falter in anything he set his mind to. Meanwhile, I was different. I craved the open sky, the rush of wind as I climbed trees, and the freedom of running until I felt the sting of sweat in my eyes. "Alex, come down from that tree before you break your neck," my mother would call from the porch, half laughing but more annoyed. Mark would sit at the kitchen table with a book in hand, glancing up just long enough to smirk at me before returning to his studies. Even in those early days, the distinctions between us were clear. It wasn't just about preferences or hobbies. It was deeper, rooted in how we were perceived by the two people whose approval we sought the most: our parents. Birthdays were the perfect backdrop for this reality. Our shared birthday should have meant a shared celebration, a double joy. But every year, Mark's party would take center stage. The backyard would come alive with balloons, games, and kids from school. Mom would bake a cake with Mark's favorite decorations, and Dad would man the grill, calling out jokes that made everyone laugh. When my turn came, it felt like the leftovers of that joy, an obligatory nod to the fact that I existed. A modest cake from the store, a dinner that came and went without notice. "Happy birthday, Alex," Dad would say, already turning back to chat with Mark's friends, leaving me clutching a wish I didn't even feel like making. I told myself it was normal. We were just different. That's what brothers were like, right? But somewhere deep down, I started to wonder why different always felt like less than. The sense of being an outsider started to creep into everything. When I brought home good grades, they'd smile, polite and brief. But when Mark came home with an A, the whole neighborhood seemed to know by sundown. My father would clap him on the back, saying, "That's my boy," while I sat across the room, feeling like an intruder in my own home. Our personalities were night and day. Mark was all focus, discipline, and quiet confidence. I was restless energy, driven by dreams that seemed too wild, too impractical to share. But there were moments when I'd look at Mark and try to find that twin bond I'd heard about. I remember one night when a storm raged outside, the thunder shaking the walls. I woke up in the dark and slipped into his room. Mark was still awake, staring out the window, his expression unreadable. I sat down on the edge of his bed, and for a second, I thought maybe we'd talk, share the way the lightning made us feel so small. But he just turned over, muttered, "Go back to your room," and that was it. If I'd known then how the next years would unfold, I might have fought harder for that bond. But sometimes I wonder if it was never there to begin with. As Mark and I grew, so did the divide between us. The house became a stage where Mark played the lead role, and I was cast as the extra whose lines were always cut. The memories blur together, but certain moments still stand out, polished by years of replaying them in my mind. The school years brought with them new challenges and new opportunities for Mark to shine. He was the kid who won spelling bees, excelled in math competitions, and brought home certificates that would be framed and hung in our hallway. Each time my parents would proudly show them to guests, my chest would tighten. There were days when I'd try to feel happy for him, because he was my brother, wasn't he? But it felt like celebrating someone else's victory while standing in the shadow of my own defeat. Our parents were attentive, but their attention had a condition: excellence. If Mark earned an A, it was like an unspoken contract for celebration. But if I managed the same, the response was lukewarm at best. I remember bringing home a science project that had taken weeks to perfect. My teacher called it imaginative and well-researched. I came through the door that day, the cardboard volcano cradled in my arms like a trophy, my smile wide with hope. "Dad, look at this," I said, holding it up. The the fake lava glistening under the light. He glanced up from his newspaper, eyes skimming over the project before settling on Mark, who had just walked in holding a certificate for perfect attendance. "Mark, another one? Well done, son," Dad said, putting down the paper to clap for him. My smile faltered, and I felt the weight of my volcano sink into my hands. The silence that followed hurt more than any words. Mark caught my eye and gave a small shrug as if to say, "It's just how it is, Alex." I wish I could say I didn't care, that my heart didn't tighten in my chest with a kind of numb resignation. But that would be a lie. Even at home, our personalities played into how we were treated. Mark would sit for hours at the dining table, textbooks spread out like a battle plan. I, on the other hand, would slip outside whenever I could, scaling trees with a reckless sort of joy. I'd lie on a branch and stare at the sky, watching the clouds morph into dragons and castles. It was my way of escaping a world where I always came second. "Alex, stop daydreaming and get inside," Mom would call. The windows were always open, and I knew Mark could hear her. Sometimes I'd glance over and catch him smirking, a kind of superiority that only deepened the silent chasm between us. There was one instance at school that highlighted everything wrong with our dynamic. During a field day event, we were both in separate races, Mark in the long jump, me in the relay. The sidelines were packed with parents, cheers echoing as kids sprinted down the tracks. I ran like my life depended on it, each step pounding against the grass, pushing harder with every breath. When I passed the baton to my teammate, we crossed the finish line first. My heart surged with pride, looking up at the stands. But my parents weren't there. They had left after Mark's event was over, not bothering to stay for mine. A classmate's mother, noticing my face fall, came over and gave me an awkward pat on the shoulder. "Good job, Alex," she said, but her voice was edged with sympathy, and I hated it. That night at dinner, the only mention of the day was Mark's new medal. "How did your race go, Alex?" he asked casually, fork in hand, knowing full well our parents hadn't been there. "It was fine," I mumbled, pushing peas around my plate, the victory already soured in my mind. Mom nodded absently. "You should focus more on academics like Mark. Sports are just extracurriculars." She shot a proud smile at Mark, who beamed as if it was only natural. I pushed back my chair and left the table, their conversation fading behind me. I stepped outside and sat on the porch, feeling the night air cool my heated skin. The stars winked above me, and for a brief moment, I imagined them whispering, "You are more than this." But it was a whisper only I could hear. If there was one person who could make me feel like I wasn't invisible, it was my grandmother. Every visit from her was like a break in the clouds, a sliver of warmth that reminded me I was worth more than my parents' indifference. The house would fill with the scent of lavender and vanilla whenever she came, her voice soft yet commanding. She was my mother's mother, and although she never said it out loud, I knew she saw everything. Every bruise that wasn't physical, every slight glance that made me feel less. "Alex, come here, dear," she would say, her arms open wide. I'd rush into her embrace, sinking into the familiar comfort of someone who truly cared. One time, after an especially rough day, when Mark's academic achievements had once again stolen the spotlight, she found me sitting on the back steps, my head buried in my hands. "What's troubling you, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice warm like a quilt on a winter night. I looked up, my eyes still red from frustration. "Why do they only care about him?" I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. It felt risky to voice it, like saying it out loud would make it too real. Her eyes softened, and she took a seat beside me, her arm around my shoulders. "It's not that they don't care, Alex. Some people are just too blind to see what's right in front of them," she whispered. She pressed a small bar of chocolate into my hand, a tradition she kept whenever she sensed I needed a reminder that someone saw me. "But remember, being different isn't a weakness. It's what makes you special." I nodded, the tightness in my chest loosening, even if just for a moment. When Grandma was around, the house felt a little less like a battleground and more like a sanctuary. During her visits, the routine would shift. Mom and Dad, usually so wrapped up in praising Mark or comparing me to him, would quiet down. Grandma had a way of demanding respect without ever raising her voice. Even Mark seemed to shrink a little when she was there, as if he, too, knew that her loyalty belonged to me. One day, she caught me drawing in the corner of the living room, lost in sketches of far-off cities and strange creatures. I'd been too shy to show anyone my drawings before. Mark's achievements were always so tangible, marked by trophies and certificates. What was a drawing compared to that? But Grandma took one look, and her eyes lit up. "These are incredible, Alex," she said, holding one up to admire the swirling towers and winged figures. I glanced at Mark, who was pretending not to listen, but whose stiff posture betrayed him. For the first time, I felt proud. "You should keep drawing, no matter what anyone says," she added, giving Mark a quick glance that made him shift uncomfortably. It was a small win, but one I cherished. It was during one of her last visits, before things started to fall apart, that she sat me down and spoke words I would carry with me through the hardest times. "There will come a day, Alex, when the world will see you for who you are. Don't let anyone make you forget that." She tucked a small envelope into my pocket, one that I later found contained a note and a little money, just enough to make me smile. The note read, "For when you need reminding that you're loved." I tucked that note into a book on my shelf, one I would read on the nights when my room felt too small, the walls closing in with the echo of my parents' disappointed sighs. Looking back, I wonder if Grandma knew just how important her words would become. If she sensed the storm that was about to come, the storm that would test every bit of that belief she had in me. By the time middle school rolled around, the tension in our house had become a part of its very fabric, woven into the air we breathed. Mark's achievements were growing, stacked one on top of another, a tower of proof that he was the son worth celebrating. For every accolade he brought home, it felt like another silent statement. "This is what success looks like, Alex. Why can't you be more like him?" School was where I started to see the cracks in our twin bond widen. We were in the same grade, of course, but our paths rarely crossed. Mark was in advanced classes, surrounded by the school's high achievers, while I found comfort in art class, gym, and a small group of friends who didn't care about grades or trophies. Still, the whispers about Mark's brilliance would find their way to me, carried by classmates who assumed I shared in his glow. "Hey, Alex, you must be proud of your brother. He's on the honor roll again," a girl from my math class said one day, her smile sincere but cutting in ways she couldn't know. I nodded, forcing a smile that barely touched my eyes. "Yeah, he's pretty great," I muttered, the words tasting bitter. At home, things were much the same. Our parents' reactions to us became more predictable as we grew older. The smallest victory on Mark's end was met with laughter, congratulations, and sometimes even small celebrations. I remember one evening when I brought home a B+ on a math test, a rare high point for me. I laid the paper on the kitchen counter, hoping for acknowledgement. Dad walked in, picked up the paper, glanced at it for a moment, and then set it down without a word. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and called out, "Mark, come show me that project of yours." His voice brimmed with excitement. My shoulders slumped, and I grabbed the paper, stuffing it into my backpack. Later that night, Mark caught me staring at the ceiling in the dark, too restless to sleep. He leaned against the doorframe, a silhouette against the dim hallway light. "Still awake?" he asked, not unkindly, but with an edge that hinted he knew why. "Yeah," I said, my voice clipped. There was a pause, long enough for me to wish he'd just leave. "You know they're just trying to push you," he added, almost as if he believed it would help. I looked at him, silhouetted, but so clearly him, the perfect student, the pride of the family. "Thanks, Mark," I said flatly, and he nodded, probably thinking he'd said the right thing. He turned and walked back to his room, the floor creaking under his feet. I stared at the ceiling for hours after that, wondering why his comfort always felt like salt on a wound. It was during those middle school years that I started to pull away. The sports field became my haven, a place where I didn't have to compete with Mark's brilliance. There I wasn't Alex, the lesser twin. I was just Alex, the kid who could run like the wind. I joined the track team, finding solace in the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the ground, the rush of air, the singular focus that blocked out everything else. One evening, I came home sweaty and exhilarated after setting a new personal best in the 400-meter sprint. I burst through the front door, barely catching my breath as I said, "I beat my record today. Coach said I might make it to the district meet." Mom glanced up from her book, her expression distracted. "That's nice, honey," she said before turning to Mark, who had just walked in with his science fair project. "Mark, did you tell your father that you're a finalist? He'll be so thrilled." The excitement drained from me like water through a sieve. I bit back the words that threatened to spill out. "Can't you see me? Just once?" And forced myself to smile. "Good job, Mark," I said instead, slipping out of the room before anyone noticed the sting in my voice. That night, I sat outside under the porch light, my track shoes still laced tight, and let the cool night air wash over me. The quiet enveloped me until the door creaked open and Grandma stepped out. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her presence solid and grounding. "Why so quiet tonight, Alex?" she asked, even though she probably already knew. I shrugged, my voice barely a whisper. "Just thinking." She sat beside me, neither of us speaking for a while. Finally, she said, "Sometimes people get lost in the brightness of one star and forget the sky is full of them. Don't you forget it either." I nodded, the lump in my throat making it hard to speak. The night felt a little less lonely with her there, but I knew the struggle was far from over. It was during the first year of high school that I discovered my love for soccer. I'd always been fast, and I had a knack for weaving through defenders, finding gaps that others couldn't. For the first time, I felt like I had something that was mine, separate from Mark's shadow. When I made the school soccer team, I thought maybe, just maybe, my parents would see me differently. This was something tangible, something to be proud of. I sprinted home that afternoon, cleats swinging in my hand and a grin spread wide across my face. The house was warm with the scent of dinner being prepared, and I found Dad sitting at the kitchen table, his newspaper unfolded like a fortress between him and the rest of the world. "Dad, guess what?" I said, breathless and beaming. "I made the soccer team." He looked up, eyes pausing on me for a fraction of a second before drifting back down to his newspaper. "That's fine, Alex," he said, the words hollow. Then, without missing a beat, he called over his shoulder, "Mark, come here. Your mother was just telling me about your midterm scores." The air felt like it had been punched out of me. I stood there, the announcement that had buzzed with excitement just moments before now lying limp between us. Mark walked into the room, a casual smile on his face, and Dad's expression lit up as he launched into a conversation about his grades. I didn't hear most of it. I just turned on my heel and walked out. Mom caught my arm as I passed her in the hallway. "We'd rather you focus on your studies, like Mark," she said, her tone firm but detached. "Sports won't get you into a good college." I looked at her, the sting of her words searing my chest. "But it makes me happy," I managed, the last word breaking in my throat. She sighed, as if I'd said something childish. "Happiness is important, Alex, but so is thinking about your future." I nodded, swallowing back the frustration. The floor felt cold under my feet as I walked to my room, the door clicking shut behind me like a final word. I sat on my bed, the silence filling the space where my parents' pride should have been. It was later that night when Mark came into my room. He leaned against the doorframe, a habit he'd picked up over the years. "Soccer, huh?" he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Yeah," I replied, not looking at him. "You know, they just don't get it," he continued, his voice half apologetic, half dismissive. "They want what's best for you, even if it doesn't look like it." I clenched my fists in my lap, feeling the frustration simmer just below the surface. "Funny, what's best always seems to look like you, Mark." He didn't respond, just shifted uncomfortably before saying, "Well, good luck with the team," and walking away. Days turned into weeks, and I poured myself into practice, chasing that rush of freedom on the field. The sound of cleats hitting turf, the shouts of teammates, the sharp whistle of the coach, it all became an escape. But home was a different story. Whenever I'd mention a game or a practice, it was met with nods that barely skimmed the surface of acknowledgement. The first time I played a real match, I scanned the sidelines, hoping to catch sight of Mom or Dad. The stands were crowded with parents, their cheers blending into a chorus of support. But not one face was familiar. I swallowed the disappointment, turning my focus to the game. When the final whistle blew, we'd won 2-1, and I'd scored the winning goal. The team swarmed me, clapping me on the back and shouting my name. For that moment, I was seen, but as the crowd dispersed, the glow of victory dulled. Teammates met their parents, high fives and proud shouts filling the field. I stood alone, the noise fading into a dull hum. That night, I came home late, my jersey still damp with sweat. I found my parents in the living room, chatting about Mark's upcoming science fair and how well he was doing in school. They didn't even pause when I walked by. How was practice? Mom called absently, her eyes on the knitting in her lap. We had a game, I said quietly. Oh, was all she replied, and the thread of conversation slipped back to Mark. I went to my room, pulled off my jersey, and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling. I replayed the moment when the ball had left my foot, arching toward the net, the roar of the crowd. I held on to that memory tightly, a small triumph in a house that barely noticed. The cracks in my relationship with my parents deepened when I turned 16. The difference between me and Mark wasn't just measured in accolades and attention anymore. It was now about trust or the lack of it. One day, I came home from school to find my parents sitting in the living room, faces tense and eyes sharp with accusation. Mark sat at the edge of the couch, hands folded neatly in his lap, his expression neutral but watchful. "Alex, come here," my father said, his tone cold enough to freeze me in place. My heart thudded as I stepped forward, my mind racing through a list of possibilities. My mother held up my phone, the screen glowing with the Snapchat app open. "Explain this," she said. I blinked, trying to process the scene. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice wavering. "What are you hiding from us, Alex?" Dad's voice rose, and the vein in his neck pulsed visibly. "You don't deserve even a door on your room if you're keeping secrets." My breath caught. It felt like the walls of the house were pressing in on me, tighter and tighter. "I'm not hiding anything," I said, glancing at Mark, who shifted and cleared his throat. "She's always on that thing," he said almost casually. "You never know what someone's doing if they're always locked up in their room." His eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw the gleam of satisfaction. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that Snapchat was just a way to keep in touch with friends. But my father was already on his feet, his temper flaring. "Enough! I'm tired of the lies," he shouted, moving past me to my room. Before I could react, he yanked my door open and began unscrewing the hinges, his actions jerky and furious. "Dad, stop!" I pleaded, my voice cracking. My mother stood behind him, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a tight line. It was surreal, watching the barrier between my space and the rest of the house disappear. "You don't deserve privacy if you can't be trusted," Dad said, not looking back. Mark lingered in the hallway, a smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. The door came off, and with it a piece of me. My room now stood exposed, a glaring reminder that I was viewed as an outsider in my own home. I stepped back, not wanting to let them see the tears welling in my eyes. I felt Mark's presence as he walked past, whispering, "Guess you should have been more careful," before disappearing into his room. That night, I sat on my bed staring at the empty frame where the door had been. The house was quiet, but the silence was suffocating. I leaned my head back against the wall, wishing for my grandmother's voice to cut through the darkness, her words to reassure me. But she wasn't there, and her absence ached like a wound. The next day at school, I plastered on a smile and pretended everything was fine. My friends noticed my muted mood, but no one pushed too hard, except for Lena, my best friend. She cornered me by the lockers, her eyes searching mine. "Alex, what's going on?" "You've been distant," she said, her brow furrowed with concern. I forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Family drama. You know how it is." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded, squeezing my arm. "Well, I'm here if you want to talk." Before I could respond, Mark rounded the corner with a group of his friends. He saw us and gave me a look that said more than any words could. "Remember, I'm the one they believe." When I got home that evening, I walked into my room and paused at the threshold. The empty space where the door used to be made my room feel exposed like an open wound. I knew this wasn't just about a door. It was about control, about trust that had never really been given. I sat on my bed, staring at the frame of my doorway and wondering how much more I could take. Mark passed by, pausing for a second. "Tough day?" he asked, feigning sympathy. I looked at him, the resentment bubbling up but catching in my throat. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, the words barely audible. He didn't answer, just shrugged and walked away, leaving me alone with the realization that whatever was left of the bond between us had been severed long ago. As weeks turned into months, the tension in the house simmered, always just below the surface. I spent more time outside, finding any excuse to avoid the heavy silence and the cold glances from my parents. But the real turning point came at school, a place that had once been my refuge. It started with whispers, hushed conversations that stopped as soon as I entered the room. My friends began acting differently, casting me looks that were either wary or outright suspicious. I brushed it off at first, convincing myself it was just teenage drama. But then one day, Lena approached me during lunch, her eyes wide with confusion and something that looked like pity. She pulled me aside, away from the crowd, her hands gripping my arm tightly. "Alex, is it true?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. I stared at her, the cafeteria noise around us blurring into a dull roar. "Is what true?" She glanced around nervously before leaning in. "People are saying you've been fighting with Mark, that you've been aggressive toward him. He told people you've been hurting him." My heart dropped like a stone. The room spun, and I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. "What? That's not true. I'd never." "He even showed up with bruises," Lena interrupted, her eyes filled with concern and doubt. "Alex, I don't want to believe it, but he said you've been acting out at home. I'm your friend, and I'm here for you, but I need to know." I felt the air leave my lungs, replaced by a suffocating sense of betrayal. "Lena, you know me," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You know I wouldn't do that." She searched my face, and I could see her struggling to reconcile the Alex she knew with the rumors swirling around. "I do, but why would Mark lie?" she finally said, more to herself than to me. I couldn't answer that. I didn't have an explanation that made sense. I only knew that my brother, my twin, had crossed a line I never thought he would. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the accusatory glances from classmates cutting into me like tiny shards of glass. The final blow came when the principal called me into his office the next day. Mark was already there, sitting with our parents on either side of him. Dad's face was a mask of disappointment. Mom's lips were set in a thin, unsmiling line. Mark kept his eyes downcast, but I noticed the way his hands clenched together in his lap. "Alex," the principal began, folding his hands as he spoke, "there have been serious allegations made against you. Mark says you've been violent at home, and we've noticed a concerning pattern based on his account." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I turned to Mark, my eyes searching for a sign of remorse, a flicker that said he would tell the truth. But he kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his face carefully blank. "Please," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not true." "Mark, tell them, you know it's not true." He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting mine with a practiced sorrow that sent a shiver down my spine. "I didn't want to say anything, Alex, but I had to," he said softly. The words cut through me like a knife, clean and cruel. Dad shifted in his seat and shook his head. "I can't believe this, Alex. I can't believe you do this to your brother. You're lying," I shouted, unable to keep the desperation out of my voice. My hands shook as I looked from the principal to my parents, who refused to meet my eyes. "Enough," my father said, his tone final. "Your behavior has gone too far, and we won't tolerate it." The principal sighed, his eyes filled with something that might have been sympathy but felt more like resignation. "We're suspending you for 10 days, Alex. We need time to sort this out." I felt the room tilt, the walls closing in. The betrayal was suffocating, a weight pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Mark sat there, silent, the corners of his mouth twitching almost imperceptibly as if holding back a smirk. I walked out of the office without looking back, the sound of my parents' murmured approval ringing in my ears like a death knell. By the time I reached the front steps of the school, my vision was blurred with tears. Everything was wrong. My parents' trust, my friends' faith, even my place in my own life had been stolen by the person who was supposed to understand me best. And for the first time, I realized there was no going back. Mark had crossed a line, and I was left on the other side, alone. The walk home from school that day felt longer than ever, each step heavy with disbelief and anger. When I reached the house, I paused at the front door, bracing myself for what I knew would come. The house was quiet, but I could hear the low murmur of voices from the living room. My parents were waiting. I stepped inside, my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. Dad looked up first, his expression stony. Mom sat next to him, arms crossed, her jaw clenched. "You're home," Dad said, his voice cold. "Good. We need to talk." I swallowed, my mouth dry. I didn't do what Mark said. I began, my voice already shaking. Dad cut me off with a wave of his hand. "We don't want to hear more excuses, Alex. You've shown us who you are." Tears pricked at my eyes. "But you don't even know my side. You're just taking his word." "Enough," Mom snapped, standing up. "We have given you chance after chance, and now this? Hurting your brother?" "He lied," I said, my voice breaking. "He lied, and you can't even see it." Dad's face darkened, and he pointed toward the stairs. "Pack your things. You can't live here anymore." It felt like the floor had opened beneath me. I searched their faces for a hint of doubt, anything to show they might listen, but their expressions were unyielding. I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Please just listen." A sound from the doorway made us all turn. Grandma stood there, eyes fierce. "That's enough," she said, her voice sharp and strong. "Alex is coming with me." Mom opened her mouth to argue, but Grandma raised a hand. "If you push this any further, I'll call the police myself." The silence that followed was suffocating. Without another word, I rushed to my room, shoving clothes and essentials into a bag. The house that had never truly felt like home now seemed like a prison I was finally escaping. As Grandma led me out, I heard her last words to my parents. "You'll regret this." And I hoped someday they would. Grandma's house became my safe haven, a place where the weight of betrayal and loss started to lift, if only slightly. Her home was smaller, filled with the warm clutter of old books, photographs, and the comforting scent of fresh-baked bread. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first place I felt safe in a long time. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, quiet dinners, and long silences as I tried to process everything. Grandma didn't push me to talk. She just made sure I ate, slept, and knew I wasn't alone. It was exactly what I needed. One night, I sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly flipping through one of her photo albums. She joined me, setting down 2 cups of tea. "It's going to take time, Alex," she said, her eyes soft with understanding. "But you're stronger than you think." "I don't feel strong," I admitted, staring into my cup. She reached over, her hand warm over mine. "That's because you've spent too long being measured by someone else's scale. Here, you get to set your own." The next day, I picked up my old sketchbook for the first time in months. The pencil felt awkward in my hand, but as I began to draw, the familiar flow returned, each line a reminder that I was more than just the shadow of my brother. Slowly, days turned into weeks. I signed up for freelance writing jobs online and worked odd hours at a local cafe to save up. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And with each small step, the anger that had consumed me started to shift, turning into a determination I hadn't known I possessed. Years passed, and with them came a transformation I hadn't thought possible. The days of high school faded into memories, distant and stripped of their power to sting. I built a life I was proud of, one where my name didn't echo in someone else's shadow. My freelance writing took off, and before long, I was publishing articles, essays, and stories that found their way into reputable magazines. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang one quiet afternoon. The name on the screen made my heart skip. Mom. I hesitated before answering, a cold pit forming in my stomach. "Hello." "Alex, it's Mom," she said, her voice hesitant, unfamiliar with an edge of something that sounded almost nervous. "We've heard about your success. Your father and I are proud of you." I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. The unexpected praise felt like a foreign language. "Thanks," I said tersely, waiting for the real reason behind the call. She didn't waste time. "We're thinking of renovating the house," she said, the pitch of her voice shifting to something more practiced. "With your success, we thought maybe you could help us out financially." A bitter laugh bubbled up before I could stop it. "You want me to help you? After everything?" There was a pause. "We're family, Alex. We need to move past what happened." I clenched the phone tighter. "I'll help," I said slowly, "but only if you admit publicly that Mark lied about everything." Silence. I could almost hear her weighing her pride against her need. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely." My voice was steady, stronger than it had been during any argument at home. When she didn't respond, I knew I'd made my point. The conversation ended shortly after, with a clipped goodbye and a promise to talk again. But I knew I wouldn't budge. For the first time, I wasn't the one seeking their approval. I was the one setting the terms. Over the next few weeks, calls and messages came in waves. My parents, who had once been immovable forces, now seemed to be scrambling for ground. Even Mark reached out, his messages carefully worded, testing the waters. "Hey, Alex, can we talk?" One text read. Another followed a few days later. "I know things were rough between us, but we're older now. It doesn't have to be this way." Each message brought back a flash of those years spent under his shadow. The silent betrayals, the whispers that painted me as someone I wasn't. I'd sit with my phone, the urge to respond twisting in my chest. But then I'd remember Grandma's words, "Set your own scale," and I'd set the phone down. One evening, after ignoring another call, my grandmother noticed my restlessness. She put down her knitting and looked at me with that knowing gaze. "They're trying to come back into your life, aren't they?" I nodded. "It's like they think a few words can erase everything." She sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, Alex. It's about deciding what you're willing to carry forward." But they never admitted it, I said, frustration bubbling to the surface. "They never said Mark lied." "Then maybe that's your answer," she said softly. The next day, a voicemail from my father came through. "Alex, we want to meet. Please, let's talk." I played it twice, searching for sincerity, for something more than need disguised as reconciliation. But I knew that without acknowledgement, their words were empty. I deleted the message, feeling lighter than I had in years. After weeks of silence, the calls and messages finally stopped. I guess that they realized I wasn't going to bend without the truth. The quiet that followed felt like a victory. Not because I'd won anything tangible, but because I'd reclaimed a piece of myself that had been missing for years. Grandma and I shared tea one morning, the sun streaming through the kitchen window and casting golden patterns across the table. She looked at me, a proud smile softening her features. "You look different," she said, breaking the silence. "Different how?" I asked, taking a sip and feeling the warmth settle in my chest. "Lighter," she said, "as if you finally know your own worth." I nodded, letting the words sink in. She was right. For so long, my life had been defined by the weight of trying to be seen, to be heard, to be believed. Now, I wasn't just Alex, the overlooked twin, or the kid who was never quite enough. I was Alex, a writer, a person who had survived betrayal and come out stronger. When I logged onto my computer that evening, an email from an old high school friend popped up. "Hey, I read your article in the magazine. It was powerful. Never knew you were such a storyteller." A smile crept onto my face as I typed out a thank you. My success was mine, born not from their approval, but from the resilience that grew when they turned away. Mark and my parents would remain a part of my story, but they no longer controlled it. They were chapters one had closed. "Ready for a walk?" Grandma asked, pulling on her cardigan. "Yeah," I said, closing my laptop. As we stepped out into the crisp evening air, I took a deep breath, feeling the kind of peace that comes not just from surviving, but from choosing to thrive. And that was more than enough.